The Orthodox Conundrum podcast is made possible by listeners and supporters who believe that these conversations matter. If your business is interested in advertising to our engaged Orthodox audience, or if you'd like to sponsor an episode in honor of a loved one or simcha, please reach out to Aliza at jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA at jewishcoffeehouse.com. Your partnership helps us continue bringing meaningful Jewish conversations to thousands of listeners every week.
I think this is the beauty that Rabbi Wurzburger saw in this dual covenant model, meaning one covenant, Brit Sinai, gives us rigid scaffolding. It keeps those in place. The other provides more color, provides the opportunity for personalization. One is about being grounded and obedient. The other gives room for creativity and aspiration. Now, Rabbi Wurzburger is not the first person or the only person to deal with this tension in religious life between being extremely rigid and obedient and then wanting to have some room for spontaneity and flexibility and even discretion. I think the brilliance of Rabbi Wurzburger's outlook is that, exactly as you said earlier, there's no balancing involved. There are two parallel tracks that work side by side, but also each one kind of keeps the other one in check.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. For many Orthodox Jews, Judaism is ultimately defined by Torah and halakha. We received the Torah at Har Sinai, and from that moment onward, Jewish life became a life of mitzvot, obligation, and commandedness. But what about everything that came before Sinai? What about the covenant with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? What about Jewish peoplehood? Responsibility for other Jews, the land of Israel, ethical mission, and the sense of belonging to a shared Jewish destiny? And perhaps most provocatively, what does all this mean for the way that religious Jews relate to non-religious Jews today? In this episode, Dr. Judah Goldberg argues that Brit Sinai did not erase Brit Avot. The covenant of Torah stands at the center of Judaism, but it exists alongside an earlier covenant that still shapes Jewish life and Jewish obligation. Drawing on Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, Dr. Goldberg explains why covenantal responsibility cannot be reduced entirely to halakhic categories, and why Jewish destiny, Jewish nationhood, and commitment to the Jewish people possess real significance even beyond formal observance. That, of course, raises difficult and controversial questions. Can secular Zionism contain authentic religious value? Is there spiritual significance in Jewish solidarity even outside full halakhic commitment? And if covenantal values exist alongside halakha, how do we prevent Judaism from becoming untethered from Torah itself? As Shavuot approaches, this conversation explores how Torah, covenant, peoplehood, and Jewish destiny intersect, and what that might mean for the relationship between religious and non-religious Jews in the modern Jewish world. And we'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, check out Orthodox Conundrum commentary on Substack. For paid subscribers, I offer this episode with a bonus question, ad-free, and released early. The question I asked Dr. Goldberg was, if you were designing an Orthodox educational system that took both Brit Sinai and Brit Avot seriously, how would it differ from the way many Orthodox schools and yeshivot educate today? His answer led to a very interesting discussion about Rav Soloveitchik's concern that students can succeed intellectually while still lacking a deep emotional connection to Torah, Israel, and Jewish destiny, along with Dr. Goldberg's provocative argument that some of the most important Jewish values simply cannot be taught in a classroom as effectively as they are absorbed naturally in the home. Paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum commentary on Substack can hear the full conversation. Look for the link in the description of this podcast. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at Aliza at jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA at jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dr. Judah Goldberg holds a BA from Yeshiva University and an MD and an MA in bioethics from the University of Pennsylvania. He studied for several years at Yeshivat Har Sinai and received a rabbinic ordination under its auspices. He teaches at MMY, Michlelet Mevaseret Yerushalayim, and practices emergency medicine in both Yerushalayim and Florida. He has authored several articles on Jewish and general bioethics, as well as a series on Brit Avot and Brit Sinai for the virtual Beit Midrash. Dr. Judah Goldberg, thank you very much for joining me once again on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
It's a pleasure, Scott. Thank you for having me.
The holiday of Shavuot is coming up later this week, and of course, as we know, that is Zman Matan Toratenu, the time that we celebrate the giving of the Torah, which is also known as the Brit Sinai, the covenant that took place at Mount Sinai. Now, Brit Sinai, of course, is the most commonly known aspect of what I'll call religious Judaism, but there's something else which is also termed Brit Avot, an earlier covenant that Hashem made with our ancestors. Now, I know, Judah, you've given a lot of thought to this earlier covenant, that which came before Sinai, and why it still matters. I'll just say, because many of us think of Brit Sinai almost as supplanting the earlier covenant or including it within it. It's not a separate thing. And I think you might have some interesting ideas about why that may not be 100% true. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. Thank you. So it's absolutely true that the covenant of mitzvot that we received at Har Sinai is at the center of Jewish life. We believe not only that the mitzvot are perpetually binding and they regulate all aspects of Jewish life, we believe that the Torah that was revealed at Har Sinai in both forms, the written law and the oral law, Torah shebechtav and Torah shebal peh, is the substance of our heritage. In our tefillot, our prayers every day, we say, Ki him chayenu v'orech yameinu, that Torah is our lives and the length of our days. In other words, Torah is everything for us. But then we have to ask a question. The Jewish story didn't start at Har Sinai. There's a narrative, there's a heritage, there are values and responsibilities and commitments that predate Sinai, starting with Avraham Avinu. And what happens to all that at Har Sinai? Exactly as you suggested, should we assume that the Torah and mitzvot that we received, that they're self-sufficient and they encapsulate everything, that if a Jew simply lives up to all the demands of halakha, and that's a lot to live up to all the demands of halakha, I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but is that it, that they're completely fulfilling all the expectations of Judaism? Or alternatively, should we say that Brit Sinai came only to add to what already existed, but not to replace it? And in that case, that leads to a very different conclusion, that a Jew is expected to not only observe halakha meticulously, but to also live up to the values and duties of earlier covenants. Now, this latter claim, that Brit Sinai adds to but doesn't replace prior covenants, that was the stance taken by Rav Soloveitchik and later elaborated upon, especially by a close but lesser known student of his, Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, who wrote about this repeatedly. Rabbi Wurzburger, he would like to quote Rav Soloveitchik that, quote, halakha is a floor, not a ceiling. It sets a minimal standard, but there's room for further virtue, further aspiration, and frankly, for further expectations. And thus, Rabbi Wurzburger coined the term covenantal imperatives. By that, he meant things that I ought to do not because there's a law that demands it from me, but because that's part of what it means to live in response to the covenant. And so he would say, again, echoing Rav Soloveitchik, that in addition to living by all the mitzvot and halachot of Brit Sinai, a Jew also has to live by the principles and values of Brit Avot, and to be attentive to the, quote, covenantal imperatives that emerge from it.
In fact, I have that book. My background is blurred for those watching on YouTube, but I have Rabbi Wurzburger's Zatzal's book on my shelf behind me, Covenantal Imperatives, that exact term. But Judah, how do we know what those values are? In other words, if we really look at Brit Avot as a separate covenant, as opposed to simply something that emerges from Brit Sinai, the covenant at Sinai, how do we know what those covenantal imperatives are? Said differently, isn't halakha still the basis of what those ideas are? And saying that halakha is a floor, not a ceiling, it doesn't mean a separate thing. It just means that we can go and take what halakha tells us further. So is this something fundamentally different?
Sure. And let me elaborate. It's interesting. The imagery of halakha as a floor, not a ceiling, gives us the opportunity to take things further. But I think what Rav Soloveitchik introduces is really the idea of flipping the picture, that not taking halakha further, but things that are actually more basic, more even, I would say, primal in Judaism, more foundational things that even, I would say, learned earlier, the same way that Brit Avot precedes Brit Sinai in terms of the history of our nation. I think even in the growth and development of an individual Jew, Brit Avot are some of the values that are so basic. They're in a mother's milk, so to speak. The things that are imbibed at home even before you learn the formal tenets of Judaism. In terms of what Brit Avot consists of, so I think you can summarize it in terms of four core values. The ones that are most manifest in Sefer Bereshit and that define Sefer Bereshit. Number one, commitment to Jewish peoplehood. That means solidarity with other Jews and commitment to the idea of a Jewish nation. Number two, commitment to the land of Israel as the Jewish homeland and the locus of Jewish destiny. Certainly, this is central to Sefer Bereshit. Number three, pursuit of the ethical. I think of Avraham Avinu's role in Parshat Vayera, Avraham taking in the Malachim and serving them, and God saying that Akiya Dativ, that I've known him, I've chosen him because Abraham has extraordinary generosity and he has a message of compassion and justice for the world. And number four, a vision for spirituality and intimacy with God that I would say it transcends mere rule following, goes beyond just checking off the boxes, but both prior to that, inspiring all that, and at the same time transcending just the rules, spirituality that is more than just religious ritual. What I think is amazing about these four values is that they very conveniently happen to cover four different areas in Jewish life that I'll speak for myself. Sometimes a person can often feel like they encounter things that are just not exhausted by the halakha. Sometimes Brit Sinai just doesn't feel like it has the answer to the question we're facing, and Brit Avot provides a different kind of language. If I can offer you a couple examples.
Please do. In fact, I just want to say quickly to go through it again because I think it's so important and so foundational to what we're talking about. So the four are Jewish peoplehood, the Jewish land, the land of Israel, pursuit of the ethical, and pursuit of intimacy with God. Is that a fair encapsulation?
Perfect. That's exactly what I have in mind. If I can give you a couple examples, I'll tell a story actually. My dear mother spent much of her career involved in Holocaust education. And the deeper I got into formal Jewish learning, particularly as a teenager, and at a time when I think many teenagers question where they come from their parents, it really wasn't obvious to me why being involved in Holocaust commemoration was so important. Because I looked in the rule books, I looked in halakha, I looked in our sources, and I just couldn't articulate it. It is hard to articulate. Why is it significant for a Jew to care about the Holocaust? I know why you have to show up to the Pesach Seder and talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt. I know why you have to show up for Megillah reading. These are all things that are clear halakhic obligations. But how can I explain to someone why it's important to visit a Holocaust museum or to go to a Yom HaShoah event, or even just to stand in silence during the Seder in Israel? And the truth is that in some ways, I think my teenage brain was correct, that through the prism of halakha, there are not easy answers. A person can feel intuitively, I think maybe my more mature self, I feel that it's part of my Judaism. I feel it's part of my Jewishness. I don't know how to describe it. I could even question whether, therefore, it's authentic. Is it real, or is it some kind of influence from foreign value system that makes me want to pursue these things? But then, at least for me, the language of Brit Avot comes along, and it argues that there's a value to expressing Jewish solidarity. There's a value to identifying with Jewish peoplehood, with Jewish destiny, with the lot of Jews, the ups and downs across history, even if I can't find a clear mitzvah from Har Sinai. And more than that, sometimes you can go and search for it. You'll search and you'll search and you'll search, and you say, oh, maybe you can see it as some kind of corollary of this particular mitzvah. But then one has to ask ourselves, are we struggling too hard to describe what we already seem to know so well? Even if I can ascribe it to a particular mitzvah, maybe it's something I already know in my heart, I already know as part of my heritage, that comes from something more foundational to my Judaism than even the halakhic system. If I tell you just another example, and this comes to mind, in fact, this story was one of the prime motivators in my own life for really thinking more deeply about Jewish values. I remember when I was in my last year of residency, one of the non-Jewish doctors in the emergency department said to me, Judah, I heard that you're interested in moving to Israel after you graduate. How come? Is it a religious thing for you? I really had to pause when he asked that question because I knew exactly what he meant. He was not Jewish, but I knew exactly what he meant by a religious thing. he meant, Judah, is one of your things. I know you won't eat what everybody else eats. I know you don't work on Shabbos. I know on Sukkot you come in with that funny branch. So is this one of your things that you do? Also, you moved to Israel. Now, I didn't feel like I could honestly say yes, because it's just not how I saw it. I didn't feel internally that I was making Aliyah because of allegiance to halacha. And it wouldn't have made sense to this doctor either, because he knew a lot of other Orthodox Jews in the medical system who ate exactly what I ate and worked on my schedule and so on, but they weren't moving.
Every one of whom would have carried that funny branch on Sukkot, but they weren't moving to Israel.
Exactly. Exactly. But then what do you say? So should I say it's not a religious thing? Can I say it's a cultural thing? What terms can I use to describe it? And when I learned to appreciate Brit Avot, suddenly I knew exactly what language was missing for me. It so deeply resonated. It was so intuitive. Aliyah wasn't about my fidelity to Brit Sinai. It was about embodying the values and the vision of Brit Avot. Again, it's not that I didn't want to make Aliyah until I knew about Brit Avot. It's not that Brit Avot taught me that this is important. It was instinctual. It was in my guts. But all of a sudden, I had the words to explain it, and that's really why I feel what I feel so compelling about Brit Avot. Why I feel it's makes such an important contribution to our dialogue. I think it lets us talk, explain to ourselves, and also talk amongst each other about a whole host of values that kind of the traditional literature doesn't necessarily capture for us.
So the radical nature of what you're saying is really important. I want to make sure that it's really understood that what you're saying is actually very different from the way a lot of people understand what Judaism is. Many people will simply equate Judaism, and I use that term in an expansive sense, with Jewish law. And what you're saying is that obviously this doesn't negate one iota, one jot or tittle, as they say, of the law, but it does add to it. You used Rabbi Wurzburger's term that halakha is a floor, not a ceiling. Part of me wonders if it's almost a parallel track rather than something that goes on top of halakha or perhaps it's underneath halakha. I don't really know. It's very interesting for me just listening because I know that, as far as I understand, Rav Soloveitchik articulated this largely in his essay Kol Dodi Dofek. Perhaps you know other places where he said it, where he talks about the covenant of fate and the covenant of destiny. This is something which talks also about religious Jews and non-religious Jews. It has many different manifestations. And the reason it's partially interesting is because the Soloveitchik family more broadly, not Rav Soloveitchik from the United States, but the Brisker world from which he emerged, from which he comes, often is seen as defining Judaism as halakha. Perhaps that's oversimplistic. But outside of Rav Soloveitchik's view of this, very often that worldview sees if it's not halakha, it's not Judaism at all. So I think what you're saying is actually, in some ways, very radical and interesting.
I take to heart everything that, Scott, that you're raising. Um, it's absolutely true that I think Rav Soloveitchik, perhaps his most well-known work is in Hebrew Isha Halacha, or in English Halakhic Man, which is really a defense of halacha. This is written in the 1940s in the face of progressive Judaism in the United States, and it's a defense of halacha. And as you said, you could almost read as thinking that halacha encapsulates everything. It is the total definition of what it means to live as a Jew. His other message, and again, I don't know if I would have the audacity to raise it myself or would I have the creativity to suggest it, were it not found in his own writings as well, and then broadcast through his students like Rabbi Wurzburger. If you, I think, look at Rav Soloveitchik's legacy as a corpus as a whole, the halakhic man is one side of it, and then at the same time, he said, "I like exactly how you described it, a parallel track. It's not beyond; it's not kind of an additional layer. In some ways, it's even, as I said, even more foundational, but a parallel track of values that complement the halacha." And as you said, when Soloveitchik turned to addressing Zionism, this became an important framework for him. And it's true. I'll also acknowledge that in Kol Dodi Dofek, it's not so prominent as a covenantal system that binds, I think, all Jews lichatchila. In other parts of his works, if you read his collected writings as a whole, and then also the accounts of his Talmidim, I think you see it more directly. But if I answer the broader question beyond that, Rav Soloveitchik said it. How do we know it's true?
Right.
What would make me believe that A Jew has to be attentive to more than just the mitzvot given to Moshe Rabbeinu.
And let me just add to that one point, at least as I read Kol Dodido Fake, on some level, it almost seems that the Brit Avot, which I'm going to identify with the idea of the covenant of fate, as Rav Soloveitchik calls it, it's not that the covenant of destiny, Brit Sinai, is in addition to it. The simple way of reading it, without going into depth, is that the covenant of destiny takes it further rather than exists separately. That's at least how it seems from that.
It's absolutely true. And the truth is, if this were a podcast about Kol Dodido Fake itself, there's a lot to say. I think one of the most insightful essays I know about Kol Dodido Fake is by Professor Gerald Blidstein, who has that contrast, I think, with other parts of the Rav's writings or another outlook where the covenant of fate seems kind of dark and almost dead-ended and limited, and the Rav is arguing for a broader covenant of destiny. There's definitely a hierarchical feel to it in Kol Dodido Fake. But if we come to other places where the Rav talks about where he actually turns to the Jews of Brit Sinai, the ones who are very halakhically meticulous, and says, you're lacking a commitment to the covenant of the patriarchs. You're lacking the values of Brit Avot. I think we get a very different feel, and it's more parallel, as you said. Bottom line, stepping out of what I'd call Soloveitchikian scholarship and asking the question, is it true, if we go to our own primary sources, is there a separate covenant that binds us in addition to the mitzvot of Sinai? So I think the strongest evidence is that the Avot keep popping up all over rabbinic literature. In other words, the same rabbinic sources that teach and promote Brit Sinai also themselves appeal to the legacy of the Avot over and over, which shouldn't make sense if halakha supersedes everything that came before it. The Avot notes, and once I have the corpus of halakha, it should be completely self-contained. The Avot shouldn't be relevant. I'll give you some examples. In the laws of charity, the Rambam, he spells out all the rules, and then at the end he circles back and he says that actually one has to be more careful with tzedakah than any other mitzvah in the Torah, because tzedakah is siman l'tzadik zera Avraham Avinu. It's the defining characteristic of those who come from Avraham. In a similar vein, when he talks about hachnasat orchim, he throws in, and you should know this is what Avraham Avinu practiced himself, and he legislated and taught to others. The Rambam invokes Avraham as the originator of this form of chesed. My observation is that apparently the legacy of Avraham adds something in these two cases that I wouldn't know if I were a Jew only following the mitzvah of Moshe Rabbeinu, that leaves something out. I wouldn't understand the primacy and the centrality of tzedakah as not just another one of the 630 mitzvot. I wouldn't understand that hachnasat orchim is not merely a fulfillment of Brit Sinai, but I do it in a sense as a family heritage. I do it because it's something that has been passed down generation to generation, apart from the mitzvah. I'll give you another example. In a different place, the Rambam states that a certain behavior is permissible, that he gives you a slew of reasons why you shouldn't do it anyway. And one of them is that the descendants of Avraham Avinu wouldn't act that way. They're universally merciful. It has to do with being kind and gentle. In other words, the halakha, viewed through the halakhic prism, the answer is clear. It's permissible. The Rambam uses the word mutar. And yet he says we're being held to another standard at the same time that we are guided by an answer to the halakhic system. The halakha is not independent, and we have numerous cases where the Rambam says some version of it is formally permissible, but you really have to evaluate further. We are being held to some understanding, and we have to ask what that standard is. And at least in some cases, he invokes the Avot, the Chazal invoke the Avot. The Avot keep coming up when it comes to even our daily rituals. The Avot are at the beginning of the Amidah. The Avot are the basis for why we insert Baruch Shem Kavod Malchut Olam Ve'er into Shema. It's a sentence that does not appear in the paragraph of Shema in the Torah, and the Medrash attributes it to Yaakov Avinu. The Medrash even goes further. It says that when we say Shema Yisrael means listen, Israel. Israel is another name for Yaakov Avinu. The Medrash says that we're not pledging allegiance to God. We're pledging allegiance to Yaakov Avinu. We're calling out to Yaakov Avinu, lying in Ma'arat Machpelah, that we continue to be bound by the same faith that he was committed to. Zrizut, excitement, alakriyah mitzvah is learned from Avraham. The mitzvah to love God, Chazal say, the mitzvah is to imitate Avraham's spontaneous love. The bottom line, my own experience in researching this is that the more one looks, the more one just sees the Avot and their legacy all over and interwoven with Jewish law. That they're not just characters in a history book, but they are the originators of tradition, that it continues to bind us alongside, and I dare say even independently, of the mitzvot we learn from Moshe Rabbeinu.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you about that independently in just a moment. But before we get there, I'd like to ask, how do we make sure that if we are dedicated to following the Brit Avot, the example given by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the Imahot as well, how do we make sure that we're not simply echoing or assimilating values that are part of the outside world? In other words, when we're dealing with things that are not necessarily codified in a natural way, if they're not part of the halakha, which writes down exactly what you have to do, and that's seen as a floor, and we have to continue going, how do I make sure that my understanding of Brit Avot is authentic rather than an expression of contemporary morality, which may or may not actually be what the Avot had in mind?
That is a fantastic question, and it gets to the heart of really the difference between the structure of Brit Sinai and Brit Avot. Brit Sinai is about laws. It's about commandments. Laws, their very nature, they are rigid, they are universal, they are objective, they are concrete. They tell me exactly what to do, and they apply the same way in every circumstance. I'll even add that laws are inviolable. So what it means for something to be a law. I cannot use discretion to override a law. The only time a law can be overridden is when the legal system itself decides that there are exceptions, such as overriding Shabbos in order to save a life. And you're right that Brit Avot is very different in its nature and therefore invites the kind of concerns that you raised. If I describe Brit Avot, how does Brit Avot operate differently than Brit Sinai? If you look into Sefer Bereshit, there are very few laws at all. What we have instead are values. God foresees the Jewish people from Avraham. They're going to have a unique destiny. They're going to be separate from other peoples in history. They're going to inhabit the land of Israel. They're going to build a society around their unique ethical and spiritual messages. But this is a vision around which God invites Avraham and his progeny, and the Imahot as well, to join him. What does it mean to live up to that in Sefer Bereshit? Actually, all you have to do to live up to Brit Avot is to submit to Jewish destiny. You have to not marry Canaanite women. You have to not assimilate into the surrounding people. You need to be willing to live as an outsider and even accept the fate of exile. You need to be loyal to other Jews. Yaakov and his sons follow this track. Esav does not. He loses patience. He marries Canaanite women. He moves to Har Sinai. And it's not so much that he's violating a rule. It's more that he's made himself irrelevant to God's covenant. I'm going to circle back to answer your question. You give me one more minute. What about for us? What does it mean after Har Sinai? What does it mean? What does Brit Avot demand for us, especially when we are already living up to so much more that Brit Sinai demands? I think the answer, again, is to appreciate the fact that Brit Avot is about values. Laws and values operate differently. Laws tell me what to do. Values tell me what to care about. I have to figure out what to do. On the one hand, this means that my response to a value can be subjective and context dependent. There's a measure of flexibility involved. There are times when a value is more manifest in my lifetime, when it's less. And also, as you said, a value is interpreted subjectively, or to the extent that a value is implemented with my discretion. How, as you said, Scott, how do I know that I'm not just imposing a foreign moral system, or I'm using Brit Avot as a pretext or a cover for something else? Number one, I acknowledge the point that Rabbi Wurzburger acknowledged the point that in his words, covenantal imperatives, that Brit Avot is going to be subject to the same critique of all intuitionist ethical systems. And I think especially those who want to promote it have to really keep that in mind. My second answer, and I hope it's not too clever, is that there is a safeguard, and the safeguard is exactly Brit Sinai, meaning the danger of having only a system of values is that they really can be taken in any direction. The fact that it is either overlaid or it undergirds, depending on which metaphor you want, a extensive system of law means that there's a very elaborate skeleton that gives us structure and holds us in place. And one who gets lost in the subjective interpretation of the covenant can only strafe so far. I would even add that I think this is the beauty that Rabbi Wurzburger saw in this dual covenant model, meaning one covenant, Brit Sinai, gives us rigid scaffolding. It keeps those in place. The other provides more color, provides the opportunity for personalization. One is about being grounded and obedient. The other gives room for creativity and aspiration. Now, Rabbi Wurzburger is not the first person to, or the only person to deal with this tension in religious life between being extremely rigid and obedient and then wanting to have some room for spontaneity and flexibility and even discretion. I think the brilliance of Rabbi Wurzburger's outlook is that exactly as you said earlier, there's no balancing involved. There are two parallel tracks that work side by side, but also each one kind of keeps the other one in check.
So by that, you probably answered my other question, which is the fact that they're independent. I was going to say, what happens when they contradict? And I assume your answer would be, and please correct me if I'm wrong, well, you may say they can't contradict. I don't know that. But assuming that one finds a contradiction or discovers the type of contradiction between one's sense of justice or morality and what the halakha demands, you can say, well, ultimately, Brit Sinai does take precedence because the law is inviolable. And it doesn't matter whether or not Brit Avot might imply, at least superficially, something else. We have to go with following the halakha. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think you also said something very important that why. So let's start with the bottom line answer. Yes, when laws and values conflict, the law trumps the value. How come? So I think the most precise answer is not because laws are more important than values. I think it's exactly as you said, because laws, by definition, as laws, are inviolable. That's what makes them laws. Whereas values are abstract ideas that call upon me to act in accordance to figure out how I want to implement them. But the value itself is not, even if there's a delay, I can't implement the value as I want. I suspend it, but I can still be allegiant to the value. I'll give you a classic example. This goes back to the early Hasidim, the Misnagdim, when polemics first surfaced about what time should you pray in the morning. So it became an argument echoed by the Hasidim that, of course, God doesn't want me getting up so early that I can't concentrate properly. Much better that I sleep a little bit later, but that I'm able to have the right, proper intention when I pray. Otherwise, I lose the whole purpose of prayer. Rav Chaim Volozhiner, a student of the Vilna Gaon, in his work Nefesh Chaim, he includes a whole section kind of arguing against this line of thought. And what's so interesting is that he doesn't in any way undercut the impulse. He actually respects it a lot. He says, it is true that prayer with intention, prayer without intention are totally different experiences. And it would be chaval, it would be unfortunate to give up that spiritual experience. But that kind of flexibility, in fact, I think Rav Chaim Volozhiner here is a great inspiration for the entire idea of Brit Avot. He says that kind of flexibility belonged only to the Avot before Sinai. They worship God in this way, where they were trying to implement values and they could make those kinds of subjective calls. He says, after Har Sinai, we simply don't have that flexibility. Not because values are less important than law, but because for law to remain law, it has to be inviolable. The way I like to say it is that I think in Rav Chaim Volozhiner's view, one who plays around with the law by their own discretion, to not pray on time is a very small infraction in terms of the gravity of the law. I think Rav Chaim Volozhiner's concern is that you're not in violation of the law. You are, be careful how I phrase this, you are denying the nature of Jewish law. You're denying its bindingness if you're willing to see the law as flexible. Usually when people think of conflict between values and laws, are also particularly concerned about moral conflicts as well. And Rabbi Wurzburger does address this at length in his writings. One thing to be clear, we're not talking about two clashing systems. It's not coming from two different cultures. We think that Brit Avot, Brit Sinai ultimately come from the same source. They are two different windows on life. They are two ways to regulate human life, all towards the same goal, which is maximal ethical perfection and maximal spirituality. And so it's not that they are going to be at loggerheads. There are cases, though, where the law is maybe more rigid than I would have liked in the moment. In a sense, I wouldn't have minded being able to operate like Avraham Avinu and live by my discretion. But in a post-Sinai world, and I think this is a positive thing, I don't mean to suggest that we should feel imprisoned. I think we should feel empowered and privileged that in a post-Sinai world I have to be allegiant to both at once.
What's so fascinating, Judah, about what you're saying is that it opens a new window into understanding some of these disagreements between whether it's Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Hasidim or between Orthodox Jews and non-Orthodox Jews. Simply the fact is that at times it almost feels as though in the Orthodox world, we will often say that doing something that's against halakha, that supposedly is in line with Jewish values, is effectively worthless. For example, if I recall, I don't want to quote exactly, but I believe that in the Nefesh HaChaim, of Chaim Volozhner's book that you're citing, in that book, he talks about davening late after the time is kind of like blowing shofar the day after Rosh Hashanah, because now I'm ready. And how absurd that is to blow shofar after Rosh Hashanah, because only now I have enough kavanah. And davening Shachris after Zman Tefillah, after the time that's allocated for Shachrit, is kind of the same thing. The time's over, it's gone. And therefore, the entire act of davening too late feels worthless. There's no point to it. But what you're saying is that that's not necessarily true. You're not saying you can do it. Of course, you agree with that formulation. Blowing shofar on Tzom Gedalia is too late. Obviously, no one is actually suggesting to blow shofar a day late because you weren't ready on the right day. Rav Chaim Volozhin is using that as an extreme example to demonstrate the principle that halakha has certain demands regarding time. In the same way, davening after the time, it's too late, what's the point? But you're saying, of course you have to follow the law, but there is something there that it doesn't transcend the law. It goes alongside the law that explains at least why someone would think that and still be within the realm of what we call Judaism, even if it's not done appropriately. I guess I'm trying to reach for the right way of putting this. And I suppose what I'm really asking is, do you think that the Orthodox world at times underemphasizes the dimension of Judaism that comes from the perspective of values and thereby negates its value altogether, that Brit Avot? Is there too much contemporary discourse in the religious world that reduces Judaism to exclusively halakhic observance in a technical sense without emphasizing the covenantal mission, the peoplehood, the other values that come alongside it? Do you think that's actually a danger nowadays in our Orthodox world?
I'll split it into two parts. In other words, is there value outside? Is there value to religious gestures outside of a halakhic framework? And number two, has the Orthodox world sometimes too preoccupied with the halakhic observance that it's losing touch with other values? The first part is an intriguing question. It's a delicate one, and we can talk about different values outside of halakha in terms of Brit Avot. There's the values, as you said, of commitment to Jewish peoplehood, commitment to the land of Israel. Those are the cases where Rav Soloveitchik, I think, answered the question very clearly for us, that Jews who are not necessarily halachic observant, but they're still committed to the project of Jewish destiny. In his case, he was most concerned with Zionism. They're committed to supporting the Jewish people and supporting settling the land of Israel. And I'll add in that you cannot support the Jewish people today without supporting the state of Israel, because that's where the Jews of the world are. That's where nearly half of them are. That there is virtue to that. There is meaning to that, even for a Jew who doesn't recognize the framework of Brit Sinai. It's perhaps a more controversial suggestion when it comes to the aspect of Jewish spirituality. But there too, I think you can actually find suggestions of this in the writings of Moriv Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. I think actually, if I remember correctly, Professor Adam Furziger actually has an article where he demonstrates this in Rabbi Lichtenstein's writings, that when talking about interdenominational conversations, Rabbi Lichtenstein wants to recognize the value to the spiritual gestures of people in the Reform and the conservative movements, even when they are not halachic. To bring it to example, a Jew who blows shofar on Tzom Gedalia, very problematic. Problematic because it's Bal Tosif. He's doing mitzvot that God did not ask for. problematic because he's violating the law, problematic because if he does it in lieu of doing it on Rosh Hashanah, then Brit Sinai clearly doesn't mean anything. Is it a completely empty act? It comes down to a semantic issue. As a fulfillment of Brit Sinai, as a fulfillment of halakha, it is a completely empty act. If there's genuine spiritual intent there, can I erase it? Can I completely nullify it? I don't think so. I think a Jew who is looking for God, who's calling out to God, even doing it in a non-traditional framework, I think one has to be very, very careful. Where do you deviate into things that smack of pagan worship? That's obviously problematic, but I think if it's coming from a genuine place, I think even if it's not strictly aligned with the halakha, look, I'm not looking to endorse that. I'm not looking to encourage it. I also don't want to erase it. I don't think, and I don't think Rav Lichtenstein believed also that we're doing a favor to God or to Torah or to the idea of pursuing God in generally to deny that.
I'll also add that there's something very reassuring in what you said, and we don't have to talk even about religious or non-religious Jews. I can talk about my own experience as a person who davens Shachris. Today is Rosh Chodesh Sivan as we record this, and thankfully today this didn't happen. But many of us have had the experience of forgetting something like Ya'alev V'Yavo during Shachrit, which according to Jewish law, you have to go and repeat Shmon Esrei. From a purely Brit Sinai perspective, if I want to go and extrapolate from what you're saying, if you did not say Ya'alev V'Yavo today, you didn't daven, you didn't do anything. And there have been times when I have forgotten something in davening, whatever it is, and I'm like, oh, does that mean my entire davening was worthless? Yes, I have to go back and say Shmon Esrei again, say the Amidah again. But I think to myself, based on what you're saying, I've always thought this intuitively, but you're giving me a new framework. That doesn't mean that all the words I said to God were basically thrown into the shredder. No, that davening was still a Brit Avot valid way of approaching the divine, even if al pi halakha, okay, you have to say it again, but don't think, okay, every single word you said to God, he just closed his ears and said, I'm not listening to that because you forgot Ya'alev V'Yavo. Yeah, law says go back and daven again, and of course we do. But that doesn't mean your first davening was, chas v'shalom, a piece of garbage.
I think that's a great point. And it's a great example. What I like the example of tefillah in general is because we know that tefillah, Chazal talk about tefillah being developed in a dual track. On the one hand, it's given a very rigid structure in light of connected to our sacrificial worship. But long before that, the Avot are credited with originating tefillah, and without going into the details, that the flexibility behind tefillah, the idea that you could actually miss the Zman Tefillah, someone who wakes up at 11 o'clock and looks at his watch and realizes that is no longer the time for Shacharit, can still pray after that. We say that there's value in prayer, even though it's not prayer on time. And one could argue that prayer is actually, that value is anchored in the precedent of the Avot, who all of their worship was much less rigid than what it is for us living up to a rigid halakhic system. And to feel the same way, a person could take down their mezuzah after many years and find that something's erased and it's invalid. Person could open their tefillin and find out something that is invalid. As you said, they got up every morning and dutifully, with utter dedication, put on their tefillin. And this means that gesture is completely worthless. To be faithful to Brit Sinai is to say yes through a formal legal prism, and we don't in any way want to whitewash that. Yes, nothing happened there, but that's not our only prism. And that's the beauty so much in having a parallel track, saying there's two different prisms through which we're looking at Jewish life. You don't have to in any way. There's a intuitive desire to balance this, or to give room to this other instinct, and we don't have to do that by in any way compromising our integrity of the way we describe the legal system. We say nonetheless there is a complementary way of looking at this.
I want to go back to your earlier statement about when you decided to make Aliyah, or your colleague who wasn't Jewish said, is this one of your Jewish things? Is this part of your Judaism? Is this a religious thing? I guess was the term you used. And that's an interesting way of putting it. Is this a religious thing? Because on the one hand, there's an element of what you're saying where Brit Sinai is the religious part and Brit Avot is the other stuff. But I think there's religious significance, I'm guessing you would agree too, although I'd like to hear you articulate it, to Brit Avot as well. It's not just, this is the peoplehood part, and this is the religious part. This is the Jewish people, land stuff, and this is the God stuff. Presumably, Brit Avot, because it's also a covenant made with God and not with each other only, is an aspect of religion too. So let's talk about that, Aliyah, Zionism, and how Brit Avot helps us understand where Zionism or Aliyah fits into contemporary discourse. As an example, would you argue that Jewish sovereignty and those who participate in Jewish national life, even if they are not adherents to Brit Sinai, they are doing something that possesses intrinsic religious significance?
Sure. I think let me start by addressing how does Brit Avot shed light on Aliyah, or the opportunity for Aliyah and on Zionism, and then circle back to the question of does that mean that it's religious? Let's start with Aliyah. I think of Aliyah mostly as a Brit Avot question rather than what I call a shaila, like as if it's a halakhic inquiry about Brit Sinai. I know there are some in the Dati Leumi camp in Israel who think Aliyah is a straightforward halakhic obligation, at least today. And in light of that, they cannot understand how all of these otherwise God-fearing Jews in the diaspora are lax about it. My response is that framing just doesn't resonate for me. There's something that feels intuitively off in it. If you read the halakha in a way that says that people who are extremely careful about a halakha and reverent about it in any other way are just in violation, I step back and say, does there mean there's something off about this framing? I'd rather presume that Aliyah is not technically. I don't mean presume. I think I'd rather dissect the sources to suggest that Aliyah is not technically obligated. But then we have to face another question. So let's say Aliyah is not a chovah. It's not an obligation. Does it mean the alternative is a davar reshut, that it's wholly optional, that it's religiously neutral, that you kind of do it if you want to or not? The same way I could read Tehillim, the whole book today if I want to, but I don't have to. I could go to the Kotel today, but I don't have to. And similar, Aliyah is just, it's on a menu of options for a seeking Jew. Here's where I think the values of Brit Avot are most relevant. Brit Avot foresees a sovereign Jewish nation in the land of Israel. It's been waiting 2,000 years for the return of this situation. I think, in light of Brit Avot, that every Jew always had to, throughout history, and has to ask themselves, where do they see themselves within this vision? The answers, I don't believe, have to be homogeneous, but grappling with the question, living with that value, and living with the response to that value, asking, what is my covenantal imperative? To me, that's the essence of living in accordance to Brit Avot. I'll circle back, and I want to say something else just about the difference between values and laws. We talked about how laws are, in some ways, more demanding. They're rigid, they are objective, they're universal, they apply in all times. And values are more flexible. But the flip side is that living up to all values, in a sense, requires even more investment and energy. Laws require me just to submit, to dutifully follow. I decide, does the law apply or not apply, and I execute. Values call upon me to reflect, to think deeply, to ask myself, what is the covenantal imperative of the moment? What does living up to Brit Avot mean right here, right now for me? I think you can say about the values of Brit Avot that Elu dvarim she'en lahem shi'ur. These are things that have no upper limit. Mitzvot are things that they're classically are shiurim. There are measures. You have to have a certain amount of matzah. You have to drink a certain amount of wine at the Seder. Whereas the values, in my mind, there's no point where a Jew can stop asking, what can I do for the sake of the Jewish people and Jewish destiny? What can I do for the sake of the land of Israel? And the answers they're different from person to person, and they're certainly different from time to time. I'll add another point. Aliyah is definitely one fulfillment of Brit Avot, but I think even for Jews who have chosen to make Aliyah, that doesn't somehow absolve them of asking that question. They need to keep asking every single day, what am I doing for the Jewish people and for the land of Israel? I'll speak for myself personally. I found a new answer recently. when I made Aliyah at the age of 32. So for me, that was a huge, huge undertaking. I was kind of like exhausted with doing things for the Jewish people, land of Israel, took a little break. And certainly the last thing on my mind was that I would ever have anything to do with the army after that point. And we now live in a changed world where Israel 2011 is not the same as Israel 2026. And I don't need to elaborate. I've begun to ask myself, what is my place and my role for Klal Yisrael, for Medina Yisrael? And I've begun looking into the possibility of drafting into the reserves as a doctor. On the flip side, for someone who has decided that Aliyah is not on the horizon, again, that doesn't mean they are now done asking that question. What is the covenantal imperative of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael? I think they too have to continue asking, what can they do for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael? To visit more, to contribute, to at least make sure that they're raising the next generation to strive for Aliyah and to be empowered for it. The answer is ultimately going to be highly personal, but the question is universal and constant. When it comes to Zionism, I think Brit Avot also very much influences my understanding of Zionism. Brit Avot says that having a strong and sovereign Jewish nation in the land of Israel that fights for Jews, lives by the values of compassion and justice, and promotes Jewish religion is a good thing. It's objectively a good thing. It is, I call it a kiyum. It is a fulfillment of Brit Avot. Brit Avot does not have to look at the state of Israel in messianic or eschatological terms. I don't have to speculate about where it will ultimately lead. Through the lens of Brit Avot, the founding of the state, it's an extraordinary achievement in its own right. It's good for Jews and it's good for Judaism. And that is, I would say, sufficient. Coming back to your last point, is this religious? So on the one hand, one of the values of Brit Avot is spirituality. In other words, to say, yes, it's about nationalism, it's about destiny, but one of them is really to pursue a close and personal relationship with God. Is it religious to be committed to Jewish destiny and to the land of Israel? I think it's a semantic question in a sense. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's part of an overall covenant with God. I would dare to say that I think there are Jews and Zionists who are atheists, but yet still feel wholly committed somehow. There's a line I once read on an Israeli TV show that I loved very much. It said there are many Israelis, they don't believe in God, but they do believe that God promised this land to Abraham, and therefore we are entitled to it. Which, again, I don't mean to pass that off as a lechatchila, but I think I'd like to see the positive elements in that.
That's very interesting. I think definitely that the G word, belief in God, sometimes is difficult for some people. And I don't mean this to be condescending, only because there are so many different ways of understanding what God means. People sometimes have a narrow view of God that they acquired when they were younger. And they can say, I don't believe in that God. I do believe God gave the land to Abraham. They may not mean that consciously. They may not mean that at all. But I like to think that sometimes part of the issue with those people who are dedicated to Brit Avot is perhaps a misunderstanding of what God implies. And maybe they never were taught that more expansive view of what God is. And therefore, there are times that people who are dedicated to the Jewish people and to the land of Israel and who will say, I don't believe in God. I'm sure there are some who don't believe in God no matter what you say God is, but perhaps they're thinking of a God that is not the same God that someone else is thinking of, and therefore it creates, I know I'm sounding like Rav Kook over here, but they're creating an image of God in their mind, which is not what God is.
Sure. I think actions speak louder than words. I'm certainly, when I see personal sacrifice for the sake of the Jewish people and the sake of the land of Israel, I personally don't worry too much about the theology behind it. I think there is tremendous virtue and meaning, and I have to imagine that Kadosh Baruch Hu assigns it tremendous value as well.
Judah, I'd like to ask you about something that might be troubling some listeners, and certainly it's something which gives me pause, because even though the framework you're articulating is very, very ennobling, and I think it's very broad-minded, and it allows for a lot, that can also be part of the danger. It can come from both perspectives. On the one hand, we have the fact that by saying that I don't really mind what someone's theology is, what matters is his actions. The fact that he, for example, came to Israel, is serving in the army, is dedicating himself or herself to Klal Yisrael and to the land of Israel, that's what really matters. but that also can allow someone to downplay or ignore altogether Brit Sinai, the importance of Jewish law. And we're saying that's a completely valid form of Judaism. And on the other hand, you can have someone who's a religious Jew, and by saying, as you did, that it differs from person to person, and that how Brit Avot is manifest is highly personal. Therefore, I can say, you know what? When someone who is a religious Jew says, I'm not going to serve in the army, I'm going to manifest Brit Avot by learning Torah all the time, because that's how I show my dedication to Klal Yisrael. That's perfectly fine, because it's highly personal. And someone like me would find that very offensive. I said, no, it's not fair for you to say your kid has to serve in the army and my kid's going to serve by sitting in the base medrash. And you have to accept that as being just as valid. And I don't accept that as being just as valid. And I'd like to know how you balance those two, if it really is highly personal.
Those are really important questions and ones that I take very seriously. I want to be clear because I think Judaism, I think our tradition is clear. There is a Jewish ideal, and the ideal is loyalty to both Brit Avot and Brit Sinai together. That's what Avraham and Moshe would want from every one of us. That is what God expects, I believe, from every one of us. That's what I want for myself, for my children, my progeny, and for the Jewish people at large. But that's not the world I was born into. I find myself in a world that the majority of Jews worldwide are regrettably not committed to Brit Sinai. That's not by my choosing. It's not by any of our choosing. And the question I face is the question that Rav Soloveitchik faced, which is, can I find virtue in partial commitment? Moreover, not just virtue, but can I find common ground with Jews with whom I share the values of Brit Avot? Let's say, even though we do not see eye to eye about Brit Sinai, and we can talk also about the opposite. I'll say for myself, Brit Avot helps to explain why to be a Zionist and why to feel partnership with other Zionists, religious or secular. The way I see it, anyone who's committed to the Jewish people and to a sovereign state in the land of Israel is a fellow Ben Brit with me, even if they do not share my allegiance to Brit Sinai. It's not that I'm comfortable with the lack of halakhic observance, it's that I'm willing to see the cup as half full, or even a quarter, or even an eighth full. Perhaps as you suggested, we're probably in the same camp, Scott. I see myself as a religious Zionist. To me, that means I find myself in the middle. I don't personally see religious Zionism as a distinct entity. I once heard, I forget who, a quote from, I think, an Israeli figure, that the most important part of religious Zionism is the dash in the middle. With me, that actually doesn't resonate. I see religious Zionism more as the convergence of Brit Sinai and Brit Avot, of commitment distinctly to religion and to Zionism. So personally, I feel connection to Jews who only participate in one or the other of these covenants. I want each group to more appreciate the other covenant. I want them to more appreciate each other, but I also myself can appreciate, they're called partial buy-in. Now, when I say partial, I don't want to, God forbid, equate these two groups. People who are enthusiastic about halakha, but they're disconnected from national destiny, and those who are at the forefront of national destiny, but not keep halakha. These are not two equal ways of being partially Jewish. There's no question that Judaism prioritizes commitment to Brit Sinai, and so are each of us expected to at our own homes and communities. Having to choose, I think the law is the law. The law is inviolable. Not only that, the purpose of the law, the meaning behind the law, the goal of the law is to provide lasting structure, and anything that in any way weakens our perception of that is a grave violation of Judaism. But at the same time, I think that an orthodoxy that is wholly focused on the execution of the law and the study of the law and has lost touch with the concepts of Jewish destiny, it's missing a piece of the puzzle. I think there's communities sometimes where there is either a implicit or explicit aspiration to be ahistoric, where there can be sentences like, we just want to worship the way that our grandparents did. And the problem is that the world has changed, history has changed, the covenantal mission has changed. The covenantal imperative, by definition, to ask yourself, what does the covenant require of me right here, right now, at this point in history? And if someone says, I want to live historically, I just don't think that's consonant with the Judaism that's been passed down to me. On the other side, there are communities, certainly there are people who live committed to Brit Avot without Brit Sinai. I do not see this as a legitimate one legitimate expression of Judaism. I don't think it's okay to buy in only partially. In this case, it's much less than partial. There's even the phenomenon of communities that they are observant, but sometimes there's so much passion for Brit Avot that Brit Sinai gets insufficient attention. It's not breached, but maybe halacha isn't observed as carefully as it could be, or maybe even it is, but Talmud Torah, the study of Brit Sinai and scholarship of Brit Sinai isn't taken as seriously. And maybe one generation does okay, but maybe by the next generation, halacha commitment is seriously impaired. How do we ensure that this doesn't happen, that celebration of Brit Sinai doesn't become an excuse or lead to the neglect of Brit Avot and vice versa, that we don't have Jews who are so enthused with their sacrifice on behalf of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael that halacha doesn't matter anymore? It's a real concern. I think it's a concern for everyone, for anyone who believes in the full scope of Judaism. My simple answer is that if you have a dual educational message, it's going to mean you're going to have to work twice as hard. Those who have the difference between being in a single curriculum school system and a dual curriculum school system, the day is twice as long. And if you are trying to impart both Brit Avot and the Brit Sinai to your children, to your students, to your community at large, it's going to require double the effort quantitatively and qualitatively.
Then let's take a step back and talk about that effort outside of the context of Israel and Zionism per se, or in the most direct sense, even though it probably is related to many other things too. Because in what other ways would you say, Judah, that Brit Avot shapes contemporary Jewish life? If we go beyond the land of Israel per se, that's one of the four values, but not the only value. Are there other aspects for Jews living, for example, in the diaspora or internally within Israel, those who already live here and for whom moving to Israel is not a question? They're here. In what sense would Brit Avot shape their lives in specific ways?
I guess I'll just give a few examples that come to my mind. Jewish peoplehood, one expression of a value of Jewish peoplehood is pursuing sovereignty in the land of Israel, but it's certainly not the only one. I'll flip it. Worrying about Jews everywhere they are. The fact that the state of Israel actually takes responsibility for Jews all over the diaspora, that the state of Israel, go back a few years, was in the Ukraine and evacuating Jews who wanted to escape to Israel, that in general, that the state of Israel worries about Jews wherever they are, that Jews around the world worry about Jews and taking care of other Jews, and that, thank God, that crosses denominational divides. That is a core value of Brit Avot, one that at times when it hasn't been sufficiently felt, I think Jewish leaders have stepped in, and this was another message of Soloveitchik's for his time, to say that this is part of what it means to be Jewish, is to stand up for other Jews. At the core of Avraham's mission is Parshat Vayera says Tzedakah Mishpat, the combination of compassion and justice. And I think one could argue that this plays in Jewish life transcends merely following the rules of interpersonal conduct. Having a Jewish aspiration, the beauty of Brit Avot, the majesty, is that when Judaism is done right, it doesn't need to be talked about at all. It is meant to be something that is intuitive. It is meant to be something that's learned by osmosis, that everybody knows, even if no one has to acknowledge it. Different than Brit Sinai. Brit Sinai is rules. God has to declare them from Har Sinai and Aseret Deborot. They have to be taught by rote, generation. Brit Avot, core values should be intuitive. I think the place of chesed and charity, I think it is so interwoven into the culture of Jewish communities. I see that being done. One could even argue through the lens of Sefer Bereshit that it's not just a part of Brit Avot, that it is the core idea, so much so that the Rambam says that if you come upon someone who seems to be overly callous and just does not seem to have ingrained empathy, you've got to question whether they're authentically Jewish, whether they come from Avraham Avinu. He doesn't say that they're in grave violation of the law. He says it could be they're keeping the law. There's no way that they come from Avraham Avinu because they're just not part of the family. And I think the other a major opportunity, I think, is in the realm of spirituality. I think there's a great thirst for Jewish spirituality. For those who do not observe Brit Sinai, and as well for those who do observe meticulously Brit Sinai, but are looking for the meaning, are looking for the warmth and the joy. I think it drives different movements, neo Hasidut, I think, in our own time. And I think actually looking to the Avot, who kept mitzvot even though they weren't commanded to, who were seeking something out of them, I think also can be a great source of inspiration.
Judah, you're saying so many things, and we are nearing the end of our time together, but it's giving me a lot of thoughts, and I'll just say two of them to come off the top of my head. The first one is, it's very interesting that when we think of Shavuot, we think of Brit Sinai, whether we use those terms or not. Matan Torah is how we think of Shavuot, Zman Matan Toratenu, and with good reason. Chazal tell us that that's when the Torah was given. But it's interesting because Shavuot is also, in a way that's less appreciated, a celebration of Jewish peoplehood. And this is seen, for example, in Megillat Rut, which is more about joining the Jewish people than it is becoming a religious Jew. I'm not denying that he was a religious Jew, but it's about joining the Jewish people. And Rabbi Nun talks a lot about how the symbolism of chametz and matzah, chametz being that which is complete. We often think of chametz as Yetzer Hara. That's certainly one of the symbolic elements of it. But matzah, he says, is the idea of incompleteness. And chametz means it's reached a certain type of finish line. He said that's true in the sense that Shavuot is the only time we give a korban that's mandated that is chametz. The Shtei Alechem is actually chametz. And because of that, he says, because we've reached something, and we've reached two things, Matan Torah on the one hand, and going to Eretz Yisrael, because it's called Chag HaBikurim. It's the time of giving the first fruits. It's the time of acknowledging we've reached it. So Shavuot is actually a time of celebration of Matan Torah, but also Brit Avot too. I think that's very interesting. We often downplay it, as many people in the religious world, as we mentioned earlier, sometimes don't really think about Brit Avot so much, but it's there implicit in what we're saying.
I think that's absolutely true. That I would say, yes, the center piece of Shavuot is Brit Sinai. It is all about Har Sinai and the Brit we had there, Hag Matan Toratenu. But there are other themes as well, if only because Brit Sinai really can't be observed in a vacuum. First of all, the theme of Jewish unity around Har Sinai, that it was an unusual event of Jewish unity, I think is a core idea. And Megillat Rut in particular is very interesting. Once upon a time, several years ago, I had an opportunity to give a lecture on Shavuot. I think I called it Rut Counterpoint to Har Sinai. That a lot of the values in Megillat Rut are exactly the values of Brit Avot as opposed to Brit Sinai. If I talk about Megillat Rut for a moment, it opens with Elimelech and his two sons running away from the land of Israel. And it was a time of famine, and the rabbis tell us that they were the leaders of the generation. Not only were they running away from the land of Israel, they were running away from the service and responsibility for the Jewish people. They should have been the Parnasim. They should have been the ones who made sure the Jews had something to eat, and they did not bear that responsibility as they should. And Machlon and Kilyon married non-Jewish women. Basically, a cluster of violations of Brit Avot, and indeed they are punished for that. Interestingly, as we talked about, there are times that you could be in conformity with Brit Sinai but still violate Brit Avot. The Rambam talks about when it's okay to leave the land of Israel, when it's not okay to leave the land of Israel. And it says, in these situations of famine, it's okay, but you should know that Machlon and Kilyon turned their backs on the land of Israel and they were struck down because of it. In other words, there are times you could be completely in conformity with the law and yet incur the wrath of God anyway. And Ruth steps into the picture. And yes, of course, she, by conversion, she accepts the mitzvah upon herself. That's what it means to convert. But so much of her conversion is joining a people. It is about her personal relationship and responsibility and loyalty to Naomi. And ultimately, the core values of Megillat Rut are the values of tzedakah, of chesed. I believe it's there's a line in the Medrash that says that Megillat Rut, it has no laws of purity and impurity. It has no laws of what's forbidden. The only thing it has is chesed. I'll even add that, maybe tie this back. the story of Jewish chesed starts in Parshat Vayera. There is a showdown between Avraham Avinu and the people of Sodom. And God, history obviously sides with Avraham Avinu. The problem is that Lot, Avram's nephew, is in Sodom. And ultimately, we know that Lot's children, Ammon and Moab, in some way, the vestiges of Sodom live on through them, that when given the opportunity to extend a hand to the Jewish people in the desert, Ammon and Moab refuse. And for that, Ammon and Moab are forever excluded from the Jewish people. And the rabbis say, but why was Lot saved in the first place? And they say because one day there will be a small seed from Moab that will yet embody the values of Avraham Avinu. There's going to be a descendant named Ruth who is going to work her way back into the Jewish people because she has exactly that component of Brit Avot that was missing. And as we know, the last words of Megillah Ruth, that this is not just a lone story in history, but she becomes the matriarch of Jewish monarchy, and that these values that come Mishpat become cornerstone of the Davidic dynasty.
That's beautiful. I do want to throw out one more thing before we finish, and that is a suggestion, and perhaps this is included in what you meant by the ethical. But once again, going back to the beginning, you mentioned 4 aspects of that Brit Avot: Jewish peoplehood, the Jewish land, pursuit of the ethical, and a spiritual intimacy with God. To me, if I look at Sefer Bereshit based on Rabbi Sachs, I think there's a 5th element. And again, this might be included in what you said, and that is specifically a sexual ethic. In fact, one of the most dominant themes of Sefer Bereshit is the importance of having a sexual ethic. Mentioning even the example of Lot and his daughters, there's an example of the violation of a sexual ethic. And over we see in that early book the importance of Jewish family life, however that's defined. And again, it's not given in the sense of laws so much as a dedication to a type of ideal where Paro taking Sarah into his house is condemned, Avimelech taking her into his house, or Rivka is condemned, whereas Avraham and Sarah and Yitzchak and Rivka, etc., that's seen as the appropriate way that a Jewish family acts. And I wonder if perhaps a 5th element to add to the 4 that you mentioned in Brit Avot is that Jewish sexual ethic. And just to conclude that thought, that can be added to the story of Ruth as well, because that's also something where we see that Ruth, unlike her ancestors and Boaz, they made sure, unlike his ancestors, made sure to consummate their marriage through the law of Yibum appropriately done. I know it's not technical Yibum, but it's a theoretical type of Yibum. It was done in a way where Boaz says, I'm going to do it together with a minyan, I'm going to do it al pi halakha. And therefore we see that another aspect of what I might consider part of Brit Avot is this Jewish sexual ethic. Do you agree with that?
I hear what you're saying. It's a good question. I'd have to give it more thought. And then, as you said, is the question of seeing it as something, an independent value or part of the overall ethical tradition. If I lay out how do I want to think about this, my question is, Brit Avot is meaningful to the extent that it fills in gaps that are left open by Brit Sinai, to the extent that it accentuates areas in Brit Sinai. In other words, like I said, tzedakah is a mitzvah in Brit Sinai, but it's not nearly as prominent as it is in Brit Avot. And would I say that also about a sexual ethic? And that's a good question. Certainly there's a lot that is encompassed by, by extensive rules. I'll maybe raise a slightly different question. I'm always, in a sense, on the prowl for values in Jewish life that seem incompletely described by a halakhic source material. And then the question I'm asking, the epistemological question is, where does this come from? If it's there, but it's not a clear mitzvah, where does it come from? Does it come from, are there complementary values within Brit Sinai? Is it a value of Brit Avot? Is it even possibly from a universal covenant that we didn't get a chance to talk about? One of those values, I think, is the value of tzniut. As much as there are books written about tzniut, about modesty in dress and behavior, I think that an honest read of rabbinic literature says that tzniut does not have a lot of laws associated with it. It is something that's honored more as a value than a law. Now, the nature of value is just as values call upon me to implement them. Sometimes values are at a communal level, at an institutional level. Rabbis put rules in place that capture that value. But I think tzniut may best be described as a value rather than starting from a place of law. And again, where does that value come from? Can you trace that value back to Brit Avot and to exactly the kinds of dynamics that you were describing? I think that might have a lot of cogency to it.
Chazal tell us that the three defining characteristics, almost genetically, they say, that's how the Baal Tanya describes it, of the Jewish people are they're merciful, they are shameful, which presumably means some sort of tzniut, and they do kindness. So perhaps that's where it's echoed, at least in that element.
For sure.
Now here is a bonus question for paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Dr. Goldberg, if you were designing an Orthodox educational system around both Brit Sinai and Brit Avot, what would it teach differently from the way that many Orthodox schools and yeshivot educate their students today? In his answer, Dr. Goldberg discusses Rav Soloveitchik's concern about Orthodox education, the role of parents and schools in transmitting Jewish values, and why Brit Avot is often absorbed more through lived experience than formal instruction. Paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack can hear the full conversation. Look for the link in the description of this podcast. Okay, well, Dr. Judah Goldberg, this has been really, really interesting. A wonderful way to go into Shavuot. There's so much more we could talk about. And this is, as I say so often about so many of these conversations, the opening of a much longer conversation. And you have given us tremendous food for thought, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to share Torah with you today, Scott. Thank you.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.